Hello, everyone. I'm David Conrad here with Ihab Shraim. We're here to talk about critical DNS and domain name security intelligence to thwart cyber attacks. You're hopefully pleased to have two CTOs. Ihab is CTO of CSE, and I am the CTO of ICANN. The agenda for this talk, I will be presenting quickly an overview of the domain name system ecosystem and its vulnerabilities. And then Ihab will talk about when threats become real and what can be done about those threats. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them at any time. You don't have to wait for the end of the session to pose questions. So talking a bit about the domain name system, the ecosystem around the domain name system and its vulnerabilities. I am the CTO of ICANN, as I previously mentioned. I've been doing this internet stuff for quite a long time and have been involved with the DNS for much of the 30 plus years that I've been involved with the internet technologies. The DNS ecosystem is all of the systems that in one way or another impact or associate with the DNS, either through the development of protocols at places like the IETF or the development of policies at places like ICANN or intergovernmental organizations. It also involves folks outside of the DNS, folks like the regional internet registries who hand out IP addresses, the W3C consortium who specify the protocols for the World Wide Web, and involves organizations like the Internet Governance Forum and the various participants directly in domain name activities such as the registries, registrants, and registrars, internet service providers, software developers, those sorts of folks. All of these individuals, organizations, and entities in one way or another are involved in the ecosystem and are subject to the threats that can impact the DNS ecosystem. So with this talk, I'm planning on talking about some of the vulnerabilities and the mitigations for those vulnerabilities within the DNS. And when I say the DNS, it's actually all the facets of the DNS, from the protocol to the namespace, DNS services, the provisioning of domain names, and the software that makes the domain name system available. Talking a bit about DNS protocol vulnerabilities and their mitigations. As you're probably aware, the DNS is at least in theory, simple query response protocol. A person interested in looking up a name sends out a query to first a resolver, then from the resolver, it issues a series of queries to authoritative servers. Those authoritative servers respond back either with a referral or some answer, and that answer is then eventually returned to the originating application on behalf of the user. So the DNS, as it was originally specified, had no mechanism to protect against data corruption. This meant that the bad guys could insert information into the DNS stream. It could corrupt the data in the DNS stream, or corruption could happen accidentally through bit flips or garbled communication. This provided a way for attackers to insert bogus information to redirect clients who are attempting to do a lookup for a particular website or other service to go to a attacker-controlled system. The mitigation for this particular vulnerability, as defined within the DNS protocol, is something called DNS security enhancements. The DNS protocol was specified originally in 1983. DNSSEC, as it's known, was originally specified in 1996, didn't really start seeing deployment into 2004. The pros of DNSSEC is that it does allow trust in the data regardless of the source. DNSSEC works by providing a signature, a cryptographic signature over the data. The trust anchor that's configured in resolvers is then used to validate that data on reception. Without DNSSEC, there's no way for the resolver to determine whether data is valid or not. With DNSSEC, if the data has been modified in any way from when it was signed, it gets dropped on the floor as a corrupt packet. This allows, this capability of DNSSEC allows for the data to be trusted regardless of the source. It could be brought in through the DNS protocol, or it could be copied from one machine to another. As long as the signature validates, the user of the data can have some faith that the data was the same as it was originally put in when it was signed. This also creates an alternative public key infrastructure with a single trust anchor. This can be seen as addressing some of the problems that are existent within the current X.509 based public key infrastructure, that of the community of trust among different top-level CAs, certificate authorities, for X.509. With DNSSEC, there is a single trust anchor. It is operated by ICANN. When we make use of that trust anchor, it's done in a very public fashion. We record the key ceremony, as they're called. We have what are known as trusted community representatives participate, and it's a very secure mechanism by which the trust anchor is updated. DNSSEC does have downsides. It increases brittleness, can enhance denial of service, and it does have a single trust anchor. If that single trust anchor is violated, the entire PKI is at risk. The DNS protocol also did not have any concept of confidentiality. All data is sent in clear text. The mitigation for this is a new enhancement to the protocol. There are actually a couple, DNS over HTTPS and DNS over TLS, basically that they simply encrypt the channel of communication. There's another one coming out relatively soon called DNS over QUIC. This is a bit controversial because the deployment model, particularly for DOH, DNS over HTTPS, can bypass network operators' controls on their networks. So, for example, if you're using Firefox browser, the DNS queries bypass the network's operator's selection of the resolver if it's configured so. And that way can bypass some of the controls that the network operator would have placed. The DOH and DOT only protect the client to the resolver. There are some discussions about protecting resolver to authoritative, but there's some challenges with that, including the potential increased load on the very busy name servers like the root servers or the com top-level domain, comnet org name servers. Looking beyond the protocol, the namespace is the universe of all possible names that are implemented within the DNS. Traditionally, they consisted of A through Z, 0 through 9, and a hyphen. And within the actual DNS queries, it continues to be the case that the character set is limited. However, recent enhancements, known as internationalized domain names, allows for additional character sets to be used in the presentation layer of the DNS. And this results in some risks related to the namespace. In the examples that I've provided here, the first Amazon.com looks, unless you look carefully, the same as the second Amazon.com. However, the second Amazon.com, if you look at the second A, or sorry, yeah, the second A of Amazon, you will see that it looks different than the first A. That's because it's actually a Cyrillic A, which in the font that is being used here shows up slightly differently than the Latin A, which is the first A. Unless you're paying particularly close attention, this can result in vulnerabilities to phishing, spear phishing, those sorts of things, where people assume they're going to a name, which isn't actually a case. This is particularly challenging given that it's now straightforward to obtain no-cost certificates that will give the browser user a padlock that says the connection is secure. It is, of course, secure, but to a potentially bad guy-owned website. Second example, similarly, the A in gmail.com is a Cyrillic A. The mitigations for these particular vulnerabilities are UIs that make the IDN use apparent. A number of browsers now exist that do not show the Unicode version of the strings, but instead show what are called the puny code, the XN-dash strings. Registries and registrars can limit what can be registered, although there have been a number of allocations already, and for historical reasons, they remain active. In the end users must remain vigilant. I'll point out that this isn't particularly new because historically there have always been typo squatting type attacks where things characters are transposed, or characters, the number 1 is used for the letter L. Whether these are vulnerabilities is obviously dependent on usage and context. I believe Ihab will be talking a bit about some of these types of namespace risks in his portion of the presentation. Looking at the DNS service, there are basically 3 separate classes. There's redirection, where the attacker can change a domain name, change a domain's name servers to point to attacker-controlled authoritative servers. A mitigation on this, you just make sure you monitor the addresses of your name servers. Also, if DNSSEC validation is implemented, the change of the name servers that have not been signed will be detected by the validator, and thus that particular attack can be observed quite easily. Resolver hijacking, this is where DNS queries are answered by an attacker-controlled resolver. You may have already heard of what are called drive-by attacks, where people are able to break into residential Wi-Fi routers and change the resolver so that they point to an attacker-controlled resolver. Similarly, breaking into end-user operating systems and changing the resolver configuration. This is also one in which the end user has to pay some attention. You have to ensure that the local configuration is valid. If you run a local resolver on the end user machine, you can also detect some of these attacks. Unfortunately, it's quite rare that DNSSEC validation is done at the endpoint. It's usually done at a resolver upstream of the endpoint. And if the attacker is redirecting away from that resolver, there's no way the DNSSEC validation will detect it. Finally, denial of service. I'm sure I don't need to explain this to this audience. The DNS provides, unfortunately, a way of amplifying DNS attacks since it's primarily UDP-based. Spoofing a source address will allow you to redirect traffic from multiple sources and without any mechanism to validate that the query is being returned to the right place. The mitigation on this is to limit resolver use. Enterprises should only allow their internal users to use their resolver. Similar ISPs should only allow their customers. There is something called response rate limiting that's implementable at the resolver level. at the authoritative server level, and that's an effective mitigation, but it requires the participation of the authoritative servers. One of the aspects of DNS service that isn't quite well understood by a lot of folks is something known as DNS Transitive Trust. This is where a domain is configured to use multiple name servers that are in different namespaces. It turns out that the way the DNS works, if there's a compromise of any of those name servers in any of those namespaces, it means that some number of queries can then be compromised. So anyone attempting to look up a name in that domain can get redirected incorrectly. These are two examples. One is .eu, which is actually pretty well configured. It has each one of those ovals presents a part of the attack surface. The second one, .int, shows an example of something that's perhaps not as well designed. It can present a pretty expansive attack surface. So in any of those ovals, if the name server is compromised, then the attacker can control responses. The moral of the story here is to try to limit the number of out-of-zone name servers you use to reduce your vulnerability to this risk. Looking at provisioning vulnerabilities and mitigations, and this is the area where most of the attacks are occurring these days. In the registrant case, the person who registers the domain, if the credentials of the registrant are compromised, obviously the bad guy can go and make any modifications they choose. There is a mitigation. Most registrars support something called registrar lock, which requires an out-of-band mechanism to unlock the domain for modifications to occur. In most cases, that's an effective mitigation. However, it is susceptible to social engineering. At the registrar level, registrars can be seen as sort of the retailers of names, where registries are the wholesalers. The registrar, if a registrar is compromised, then any of the names that are registered through that registrar can be changed. This mitigation there is registry lock, which does sort of the same thing as registrar lock, except at the registry level. And finally, with registries, if the registry is compromised, then any name in that registry's namespace can be modified. These aren't theoretical attacks. As some of you might have heard of an attack that Cisco Talos called Sea Turtle. Before that was DNS espionage. In those attacks, both registries and registrars were compromised, leading to significant compromise of the names within those namespace. Finally, software vulnerabilities and mitigations. The vulnerability here is the fact that the DNS protocol itself has become incredibly complicated. There's a term called the DNS camel, which describes basically the problem of too many features being added to the protocol. The original DNS specification was 2 documents known as RFCs, requests for comments. There were about 110 pages. Currently, there are about 300 RFCs that are relevant to the DNS. Only 108 of those are needed for the standard implementation of the DNS, but that does give you an idea of the total complexity of the DNS protocol. It works out to something on the order of 4,000 pages. Obviously, everyone who's implementing a DNS server is going to create bugs because it is such a complex system. So the mitigations here are to have diversity, have multiple implementations, compile out or turn off all unnecessary features, obviously put your domain or your name servers in a jail so that if it is compromised, the bad guys won't have complete access. So summarizing, the DNS is a very complex system. It provides a ubiquitous service that's critical to the functioning of the internet. Each part of the DNS and part of the DNS ecosystem has its own set of vulnerabilities. And mitigations for those vulnerabilities require participation of all the actors in the ecosystem. And with that, I will hand it off to Ihab. Thank you for listening to my portion of the talk.
Thank you very much, David. So as David indicated, David showed us a quick synopsis about how the DNS ecosystem could be jeopardized. It's a very interesting phenomenon that is what's happening today. But what I'm going to show you basically is to dovetail to what David had mentioned to you, to look at the attack surface and how companies are targeted today. But most importantly, how do we tie it to something that we see today, which is our COVID pandemic? Go to the next slide. Just a quick one before I begin. My name is Ihab Shraim. I'm the CTO of CSC. In fact, you can look us up at cscdbs.com. What I'm about to show you is what are these threat vectors targeting the domain name ecosystem. What we have looked at is the entire ecosystem, and we're tying it, as I said earlier, to the COVID pandemic. And we have a lot of interesting data that we would like to share with you. Just to a quick background. Okay, so companies today, based on what we are seeing and based on our product suite offering, they really are overlooking domain name domains as well as DNS security risks. What do we mean by that? Well, based on our customer base, as you probably know, CSC is the largest B2B, as in corporate B2B, domain name registrar, globally that is. And we see all the phenomenons that do happen on the ecosystem related to the top level domain names, as well as the CCTLDs and the new TLDs, etc. What we are seeing is that companies are overlooking some blind spots. And we do know that they are really taking security seriously. But sometimes some of these mishaps that we are seeing that are occurring on the domain name ecosystem, the digital certificates, and as my colleague said, that on the DNS infrastructure, these threat vectors are being a bit overlooked. And basically, they directly affect the actual foundation of what an online presence for a corporation would look like. So the online presence is crucial for any company. And these are the attack surfaces that bad actors target. They target the corporate website, they target their email infrastructure, they target vulnerabilities within the exposed applications. What would that result in is in website redirections, meaning for the primary website, if you don't take the appropriate measures to protect that domain name ecosystem, the corporation can end up with a compromised email, a network breach. The brand reputation itself could be jeopardized, or you can have revenue leakage, you can have gray market distribution if it's an online e-commerce site. There's a multitude of problems that could happen to the brand itself. And in a lot of cases, as we have seen with a lot of breaches out there in the past few years, data exfiltration is crucial to bad actors because they can sell that data in the dark web. And there is a huge ecosystem within the dark web, as everybody knows. So what does CSC offer today around domains and DNS to provide what we classify as a holistic approach toward protecting the online presence and protecting those digital assets online. Well, we look at the domain name as a portfolio, and we secure it. And as my colleague indicated, we introduce registry locks, we look at the DNS posture, and we secure the obvious. And these are, like I said, these are blind spots that a lot of companies overlook. And that gives you the first layer of protection. And then we protect the actual brand, meaning the brand online, where it's being abused under a multitude of angles, under gray market distribution, counterfeit, and so forth. And then we look at it from the perspective of the third layer as how do we protect it from fraud threat vectors, as in phishing, malware, etc. In other words, we look at the presence of a corporation online as a 360 cybersecurity coverage toward detecting and mitigating these threat vectors. What we mean by mitigation, we conduct enforcement. And we are the largest enforcer on the internet today. And in fact, we are the #1 UDRP filer on the internet. So how do we tie the dots with what David had mentioned to you, and what are these threat vectors we are alluding to? Well, let's take what we are seeing for the past year or so. We are under a pandemic, a COVID pandemic, and we decided to conduct a research comprehensive study around that phenomenon. So basically what we've done is, in real time, we are looking at the domain name ecosystem, comprehensively that is. We're looking at the brand presence online and the phishing threat vectors targeting these brands. And we do it by looking at multiple platforms, from a domain name perspective monitoring, from internet monitoring as in search engines, from a brand protection space, we look at marketplaces and e-commerce monitoring, social media with all the platforms that are available out there, and of course, we look at mobile apps. So I just want to give you a quick summary, and then we are planning to dive into the data to give you some more detail about what took place between January of last year until today. What we have found, what our study has found, is there were to date about 325,000 plus COVID-related domain name registrations. These are new registrations associated with COVID. The top targeted country, unfortunately, is the United States. The top GTLD, which is .com, has 64% of the 325,000 newly registered domain names. On the CCTLD side, it's .co.uk, which constitute about 2.5% plus. The top ISP, targeted ISP, which is a favorite ISP for domain name registrations and to launch these threat vectors against a certain brand, is GoDaddy. What we also found is more than 645 plus individual online stores associated with selling a cure, as in COVID cure. There's 65,000 searches as the average search results for COVID cure through Google. So let's take the data deeper. Let's tie that with main events that took place that we are all aware of. And let's relate that with our domain name registration based on the 325,000 and see the trend. What is that trend? What we found, if you look at my cursor here, in the very beginning, when it all emerged in China, which is around January, February timeframe of 2020, is that the domain registrations began to spike up a little bit. And then it spiked up extremely high when the US reported 2,000 deaths. Well, that tells us that the bad actors are reacting to the events. The ecosystem of domain name registration really tracks the main events. In fact, if you look at the next peak, which will be the pandemic stimulus checks, meaning they can launch attacks to steal identity, steal the stimulus check funding from the recipients of that stimulus check within the United States. We'll also look at this trend. When the vaccine became available, we see a spike. What does that also tells us? It tells us that when an event takes place, a lot of domain name registrations take place, but how does that affect the drop domain names? We said, fine, let's look at the vaccine data. So if we track when the vaccines came about, and to tie the dots just in 3 months, we find that those vaccines are today on, as you can see, the green constitute the registrations, and look at the drops. They are trailing, meaning the time interval to make the attack happen is short, meaning it's event-driven, meaning it has to have a dynamic nature to try to track these threat vectors and mitigate them. In other words, real-time threat vector management is key here. All right, so let's take a look at the data that I have been discussing with you. Let's see what are the percentages. What we found is from the 325 plus thousand domain names that got registered, 75% of them were connected with GTLDs. CCTLD is about 9.7, almost 10%. But the new TLDs is the big surprise, is 11%, which is quite high. And new TLDs like online, site, etc. SLDs, as in secondary level, top level domain names, second level domain names, constitute about 3.6, which is a significant number of the, and SLD can be, for example, like a blog post or My Shopify, etc. As you can see here, we really track and tag the data very closely and very precisely. And the reason why this study is important, by the way, this study is well sought out by a lot of universities, a lot of entities that do research are asking for that data from us because we happen to be the one who started with it and really tracked it in very minute detail with respect to the domain name ecosystem. So let's take a quick summary. So who are the top countries? Who are the top ISPs? What are the top keywords? Now we're going to zoom on the data to the keyword level to understand the brand association and the threat vectors targeting these brands. Not surprisingly, the United States takes number 1, Germany, France, and here's the surprise, Russia. That means they have good environments and environments that can be hacked. So Russia, it was a surprise to us to be the number 5 slot. Now, of course, we have data and we can rank it all the way down to even if you have one threat or one domain name associated with a live DNS record, but we show here 5 results. The top ISPs, of course, we've talked about GoDaddy, Cloudflare, Amazon Web Services, and Google Cloud. The keywords are interesting. We're going to zoom now on the keywords. COVID-19, coronavirus, they take the top 2 ranks, and then COVID. And you're going to see now the data that I'm going to show you is all associated with that data set. Okay, great. Anyway, so we divided the data into 3 sections, from January to June, and then from June and forward, from November to now. As you can see, the top ranks do change depending on what the data set we are dealing with. And that's kind of important to note because it depends on where are the search terms and the event that is taking place. All right, as my colleague referred to, the homoglyphs are critical. We see that in domain name spoofing variation. But I would like to share with you that data set that is a little bit different. So we wanted to go track the data with respect to, all right, 325,000 plus. Where are the brands being hit? In what category? We found that 36% is associated with treatment, testing, 32%, e-commerce attacks, as in e-commerce stores associated with certain brands, that takes 31%. And by the way, 38,000 of these domain names contain coronavirus, and 152,000 contained a string of COVID. So we developed an internal technology that it clusters the data and it looks at it geographically, by country, by ISP, and it connects to a seller. This is a critical technology, one of a kind. It's called clustering technology, and it allows us to get to know where the attack or the threat vector targeting the brand is going to go. This is an example of a targeted brand, but this is another example of where the owner of that bad actor, he's selling counterfeit boxing and labeling to whatever you want to sell. In other words, he's giving you on the 0 to 100 counterfeit, customized logos, boxing, etc., to ship these products. It's quite interesting. Of course, attacks are connected with heat map. Almost every country had experienced that attack, but the heat maps were probably the most, where you download the heat map itself to track coronavirus across the world, and then you introduce malware to that site because there's an infection. So how does that happen? I'd like to just go quickly and show you how the attack threat vector happens. Normally, a bad actor is after, as you know, stealing identity, insurance, money, etc. It's in the scam. And the scam, they target a certain group of people. And in this case, we are zooming on older folks because it's easy to steal their money. So how do they do that with false advertising? Basically, they send either an email, or in social media, they send a fake site. By clicking on it, you introduce the malware into that particular machine, and then the host is infected. And as soon as the host is infected, either it gets merged by a botnet, as in through a command and control instruction, meaning that's the second layer of instructions. Now they own the machine, or they harvest the data out of that machine. What do we do? What should we do? Quickly, we would recommend to have a global secured registrar to protect that domain name ecosystem associated with that brand. And we track your online presence from the perspective of how the brand is being used online and where is the abuse against that brand, and use tools like early warning detection toward critical threat vectors. CSC offers that, and then work with a global enforcement company that will mitigate that problem for you. So in summary, David and I have given you a quick synopsis about what is happening out there as in threat vectors targeting the domain name and DNS ecosystems. We wish you the best of luck. Please ask us any questions you may have. And thank you very much for listening to us.